One quiet afternoon, a woman named Emily found herself in an unexpected situation that would change her life forever. Emily had just finished grocery shopping and was driving home on a calm suburban road. The sun was shining, and everything seemed normal. As she turned onto her street, the unexpected happened. A car suddenly slammed into the back of her vehicle, sending her heart racing. It wasn't a major crash, but enough to jolt her and leave her shaken. The other driver quickly stepped out of his car to check on Emily. He seemed apologetic, but also somewhat nervous. Both of their cars were damaged, though the impact wasn't severe. They were lucky it wasn't worse, and Emily didn't feel hurt. But as they were discussing what to do next, something caught her off guard. A fire truck pulled up, sirens blaring, and a group of firefighters stepped out. Firefighters are supposed to be the people who come to help in emergencies. They are trained to save lives and offer comfort in tough situations. But the moment Emily saw them, she knew something was wrong. Instead of offering reassurance, the firefighters acted with a surprising coldness. One of them barely looked at her as they started assessing the damage. Another firefighter muttered something under his breath, probably about the accident being too minor for a response, but loud enough for Emily to hear. Instead of helping her feel safe, Emily started to feel even more uncomfortable. One firefighter joked about how some people just can't drive, while another was too busy making phone calls to pay attention to her. Emily, already shaken up by the crash, now found herself being treated like she was somehow at fault. She could hardly believe what was happening. She had expected empathy, professionalism, even just some basic kindness from the people who were supposed to be there to help her. But instead, all she got was coldness. As the firefighters finished their work and prepared to leave, Emily felt humiliated. She was embarrassed by the way they had spoken to her. She couldn't help but wonder if it was because they didn't take her seriously. Maybe it was because the accident seemed so small compared to the kinds of emergencies they were used to handling. But whatever the reason, she felt ignored, disrespected, and deeply upset. What made it even harder for Emily was that she didn't know how to handle the situation. She wanted to speak up, to tell them they had treated her wrongly, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was the realization that arguing with them in that moment wouldn't make anything better. Maybe she thought it wasn't worth it, or perhaps she was just too stunned to speak her mind. Emily kept her feelings inside, choosing not to say anything at the scene. But as she drove home that day, the anger and hurt she felt started to build up inside her. She didn't like feeling powerless. She couldn't let this go. She thought about how differently things might have gone if she had been treated with more respect. She knew she had every right to feel upset, but she also wondered what she should do next. The entire situation weighed on her mind. It wasn't just about the accident anymore. It was about being treated with dignity. Emily began to feel conflicted. She didn't want to make a big fuss over something so small, but the more she thought about how she had been treated, the more she felt like something needed to be done. But what? What could she do about the firefighters who had mistreated her so openly? At this point, Emily didn't yet know that this incident, so small on the surface, would soon spiral into something much bigger, something that would take her down a path she never expected to walk. Something that would not only change her life, but also open up a whole new chapter in the way her community would look at respect, responsibility, and professionalism. And she certainly didn't know yet that the person who would end up standing by her side and making sure her voice was heard wasn't just anyone. It was her husband, the governor. As the days passed, Emily couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The whole incident replayed in her mind over and over again. She couldn't understand how the firefighters had treated her the way they did. She had always seen them as heroes, people who were there to help in times of need. Yet, in her moment of vulnerability, they had done nothing but make her feel small and unimportant. Her frustration grew each time she thought about it. She had always been a strong person, someone who stood up for herself and others, but this time she felt powerless. The worst part was that she couldn't shake the feeling that the firefighters hadn't just disrespected her, They had dismissed her as if she didn't matter. It wasn't just about the accident anymore. It was about the way they made her feel. She knew she deserved better. Emily wanted to talk about it with someone, but she didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want to seem like she was overreacting. After all, it wasn't like she had been seriously injured or anything. It was just a small car accident. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that it wasn't the severity of the accident that mattered. It was how she had been treated in the aftermath. It wasn't long before Emily confided in a close friend, someone she trusted deeply. As she explained everything that had happened, her friend listened carefully, nodding with understanding. "You shouldn't have been treated that way," her friend said. "You deserve respect, especially in a moment like that." Her words were comforting, but Emily still wasn't sure what to do. Later that evening, Emily sat down with her husband. He was in the middle of a busy workday, preparing for a big meeting, but she couldn't keep the incident to herself any longer. "Something happened today," she said softly, looking at her husband. "I had a car accident. It wasn't serious, but the firefighters who came to help, they treated me terribly." Her husband, who had always been attentive and supportive, stopped what he was doing. He turned to her with concern. "What do you mean? What happened?" he asked. Emily told him everything. She explained how the firefighters had mocked her, how they hadn't offered any comfort, and how they had treated her as if she didn't matter. She felt embarrassed just reliving the moment, but she knew her husband needed to hear the whole story. As Emily spoke, she saw the change in her husband's expression. He was no longer just listening. He was visibly upset. "That's unacceptable," he said firmly. "Nobody should treat you like that, especially in a moment when you're vulnerable." Emily felt a weight lift off her shoulders as she heard him speak. She had been feeling alone in her frustration, but now she realized that she wasn't. Her husband's reaction reassured her that she wasn't overreacting. He understood exactly why she felt the way she did. He wasn't just listening for the sake of it. He was genuinely angry on her behalf. The more they talked, the more Emily began to feel a sense of relief. For the first time since the incident, she felt that someone had her back. She wasn't just another person to be ignored or mistreated. She was important, and her feelings mattered. Her husband promised her that he would do everything in his power to make sure the situation was addressed properly. At that moment, Emily didn't realize how much this conversation would set in motion. She had no idea that her husband, who was not just a supportive partner, but also the governor, would take this matter to the highest levels of authority. He was determined to make sure that no one else, especially not his wife, would ever have to go through such an experience again. What had started as a small, seemingly insignificant incident was now the catalyst for something much bigger. Emily had never imagined that the simple act of sharing her frustration would lead to a change in the way the fire department operated, but that was exactly what was about to happen. And all it took was one person, her husband, to take her side and demand accountability. The next morning, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She had been replaying the conversation she'd had with her husband, the governor, and the more she thought about it, the more determined she became to see things through. Emily wasn't just going to let the incident slide. She had spoken up, and now she wanted to make sure that something was done about it. Her husband had promised to look into the matter, but Emily didn't want to sit around waiting. She knew her husband had a lot on his plate, especially with his demanding job, but this wasn't something she could easily forget. The more she thought about the firefighters' behavior, the more she realized how wrong it was. People in positions of power, especially those who were supposed to protect others, shouldn't treat anyone like that. It was important to stand up for herself, and in a way, she felt like standing up for everyone who might find themselves in a similar situation. As the day went on, Emily tried to focus on her usual routine, but her mind kept drifting back to that moment. The mocking words, the dismissive gestures, the lack of care. She decided to call her friend again, hoping to get some clarity. Her friend listened patiently as Emily explained her feelings. I know it wasn't a big deal, but it still feels like it was. It's like I'm just invisible to them, Emily admitted. Her friend paused before speaking, offering a comforting thought. You're not invisible. You're someone who deserves respect, and sometimes that's exactly what people forget. You have every right to feel upset. Emily felt a little bit of relief hearing those words. She hadn't realized how much she needed validation until now. Meanwhile, Emily's husband, the governor, was already working on the issue. He had made some calls that morning to get a full report on the firefighters' actions. His team began to gather information, speaking with other people who were at the scene of the accident and reviewing how the fire department typically handled situations like this. Emily didn't know the full extent of what was happening behind the scenes, but she trusted her husband to take care of it. She felt a mix of nerves and anticipation as the day stretched on. Late in the afternoon, her husband sat down with her to discuss the next steps. He had gathered the facts and had already started making changes to how the fire department operated. I've spoken to the fire chief, and we've started an internal review of the situation. The behavior you described was unacceptable, and it won't be tolerated. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. Emily was both relieved and a little shocked. She had expected her husband to take the situation seriously, but hearing that action was already being taken made her realize just how much power he had in making a difference. She had never really thought about the behind-the-scenes work that went into running a state, but now she understood that her husband wasn't just a political figure. He was someone who truly wanted to make positive change, no matter how big or small the issue was. As the conversation continued, Emily felt a growing sense of pride. She had been hesitant at first to speak up, unsure of whether her feelings would be taken seriously. But now, seeing the wheels of change already in motion, she understood the power of standing up for what was right. It wasn't about revenge or getting back at the firefighters. It was about making sure that others didn't experience the same mistreatment she had. That night, Emily went to bed feeling a little lighter. The situation wasn't over, but she knew that the journey was just beginning. The fact that her voice had been heard meant more than she had initially realized. She was starting to see that sometimes, the smallest moments, like a chance encounter with someone who doesn't treat you well, could turn into something bigger, something that could create real change. And for the first time since the accident, Emily felt hopeful about what was to come. The following week, things started to feel like they were moving quickly, and Emily began to realize just how serious her husband was about addressing the issue. As the governor, he had resources at his disposal, and he wasn't the type to let something like this go unnoticed. She knew he was used to dealing with much bigger challenges, but this one seemed personal to him, and that made Emily feel even more supported. The fire department, after being called into a meeting with the governor's office, quickly realized that what had happened on the day of Emily's accident couldn't just be swept under the rug. The firefighters involved in her mistreatment had to answer for their actions. It was clear that there was a culture within the department that needed to be addressed. It wasn't just one firefighter who had acted inappropriately. It was several. That realization made Emily feel even more determined to see things through. She wasn't alone in this, and she was no longer the only one who felt wronged. Her husband had made it clear to the fire chief and department leaders that respect for the public was not negotiable. This isn't just about one woman's experience, he had said during the meeting. It's about how the people we trust to protect us behave when they think no one is watching. Emily's husband wasn't just reacting out of anger. He was speaking up for the community and for the values that mattered most to him and to Emily: dignity and respect. Emily didn't know the full details of what had happened behind closed doors in the meetings, but she did know that there were consequences. The fire department had to undergo an internal review to ensure better professionalism and respect. The firefighters involved in her incident were held accountable, but more importantly, the entire department would be going through retraining programs on how to interact with the public in a more compassionate, supportive way. While Emily was grateful for the steps being taken, she couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy about the whole situation. The public scrutiny that followed wasn't easy to ignore. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, people in their town were talking about the incident. Emily's experience became part of the larger conversation about the way emergency services treated citizens. Some supported her, while others argued it was an overreaction. But what struck Emily most was how many people reached out to her privately, sharing their own experiences of mistreatment from public service workers. It made her realize that, in many ways, her story wasn't unique. Emily began to understand that her small act of speaking up had opened a door for others to voice their own concerns. She heard from people who had been treated poorly by various authorities: teachers, police officers, doctors, and even local government workers. It was eye-opening for her. She hadn't known just how many people had felt the same sense of powerlessness. She found herself talking more openly about her experience. She wasn't just Emily, the wife of the governor, anymore. She was someone who had taken a stand, and her story had inspired others to do the same. In some ways, the entire experience had changed her. It had given her a sense of purpose and a belief that standing up for what's right, even in the face of discomfort, was important. She didn't want to be just another person who let things slide. Emily wanted to be someone who helped make a difference. As she watched the fire department go through their training and the community engage in conversations about respect and accountability, Emily felt a growing sense of pride. What had started as a difficult, uncomfortable experience had turned into something much more significant than she could have imagined. It wasn't just about correcting the actions of a few firefighters. It was about making sure that no one else had to go through what she had experienced. It was about setting a precedent that respect and dignity should always come first, no matter who you are or what position you hold. The entire ordeal made Emily reflect on the importance of speaking out, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you. She learned that change doesn't always come easily, but sometimes all it takes is one person to say enough is enough for others to find their voices too. And in the end, that was the real power of her story, not just the personal vindication, but the ripple effect it had on the community. Emily was no longer just a bystander in her own life. She was part of something bigger, a movement toward fairness and respect for everyone. As the days went by, Emily felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, she was relieved that the fire department was addressing the issue, but on the other, she couldn't help but feel a little uneasy with how quickly things were moving. The media had picked up the story, and it was hard to avoid the constant attention. Every time she opened the newspaper or turned on the news, there it was, headlines about the firefighters and her experience. Some people saw it as an important issue, while others thought it was being blown out of proportion. But Emily wasn't focusing on the opinions of others. She had learned that standing up for what was right wasn't always going to be popular. She had seen firsthand how difficult it could be to challenge authority, especially when people were set in their ways. Yet, she had also discovered the power of her voice. More people than she ever expected had reached out to her, sharing their own stories of being mistreated or ignored by public service workers. It was clear to her now that this issue went far beyond one small incident. There was a larger problem that needed to be addressed. Emily began to use her newfound platform to raise awareness. She wasn't looking for fame, but she realized that her situation was part of a bigger conversation that needed to happen. Through social media and conversations with local community leaders, she helped bring attention to the importance of respect, professionalism, and accountability in public services. Her husband, the governor, was fully supportive of her efforts, but he didn't want her to carry the burden alone. Together, they started meeting with local community groups, encouraging people to share their experiences and help drive change. Emily found herself speaking in front of groups, sharing her story, and listening to others. It wasn't always easy for her. Standing in front of a crowd made her nervous, but she knew it was necessary. She wanted people to understand that even small moments of mistreatment could have a lasting impact, and she wanted others to know that their voices mattered. One afternoon, Emily was invited to speak at a community meeting about the importance of improving the relationship between emergency services and the public. It was an opportunity to share her experience and hear directly from others who had similar stories. As she stood at the front of the room, facing a group of people who were eager to listen, she felt a wave of emotion. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about creating a safer, more respectful environment for everyone, no matter who they were or what kind of service they were receiving. As Emily shared her story, she saw the faces of the people in the room change. They weren't just listening, they were connecting. She could see in their eyes that they understood what she was saying. Some nodded in agreement, while others quietly wiped away tears. Emily realized how much this conversation was needed. It was a chance to bring people together and make real change. Over time, the fire department began to show visible signs of improvement. The retraining program for the firefighters was just the beginning. Emily's story had sparked a deeper conversation within the department about the way they interacted with the community. It wasn't just about following the rules, it was about creating a culture of respect, where everyone felt valued. Even as the public attention eventually died down, Emily knew that the change she had helped set in motion would last. She could see it in the small shifts that were happening in her community. People were starting to speak up when they felt mistreated, and authorities were listening more carefully. In the end, Emily didn't just help to change how the fire department operated. She helped to change the way people thought about respect and the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. What started as a small moment of mistreatment turned into a movement, one that would continue to make an impact for years to come. Emily had learned that change wasn't always easy, but it was always possible. It wasn't just about correcting one wrong, it was about creating a better future for everyone. And for the first time, Emily felt proud not just of the progress that had been made, but of the role she had played in it. She had spoken out, and it had made a difference. She had turned a negative experience into something that could help countless others in the future. And that was something worth fighting for. Weeks went by, and Emily began to notice the subtle changes taking place in her community. The fire department's retraining program was underway, and though it wasn't a quick fix, she could already see improvements. The firefighters were more respectful when they interacted with people, and there was a clear effort to ensure that everyone felt heard and valued, no matter what the situation was. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As she went about her daily life, Emily felt a growing sense of pride. She had faced a difficult and uncomfortable situation, but it had led to something positive. People were beginning to feel more comfortable speaking up when something didn't feel right. Emily wasn't the only one anymore. Others were following her lead. Her story had inspired people to stand up for themselves and to demand respect, no matter what position someone held. Her husband, the governor, was also feeling a sense of accomplishment. He had worked hard behind the scenes to ensure that the fire department's internal review would lead to real change. It hadn't been easy, and at times it had felt like an uphill battle. But Emily had shown him just how much one voice could matter. Her courage to speak out had sparked a change that wouldn't have happened otherwise. They had started talking about how they could continue to make a difference, not just within the fire department, but in other areas of public service too. Emily's experience had opened their eyes to the need for better training, more accountability, and a deeper sense of compassion within various institutions. They started meeting with leaders from other departments, discussing ways to improve the relationship between the public and those who serve them. At one of these meetings, Emily was asked to share her story again. This time, it was in front of a room full of teachers, police officers, and other public service workers. It wasn't easy for Emily to speak publicly, especially about such a personal experience, but she knew it was important. She wanted to remind everyone that at the heart of their work was one simple truth: respect. Whether you were helping someone through an emergency, teaching a child, or serving a community, everyone deserved to be treated with dignity. As she spoke, Emily saw the impact her words were having. The room fell silent as she shared her experience with the firefighters. She didn't focus on the anger or the hurt she had felt. Instead, she spoke about the power of kindness, the importance of understanding, and the need for empathy. She emphasized that public service was about more than just following rules. It was about making people feel safe and respected. When she finished, there was a moment of quiet before the room erupted into applause. Emily felt a lump in her throat as she realized how much her words had resonated. She wasn't just telling her own story anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever felt overlooked or dismissed by those who were supposed to help them. The response was overwhelming. Many people came up to her afterward, telling her that her words had inspired them to reflect on how they treated others. It was a moment of recognition she hadn't expected, and it made her realize just how far-reaching her actions had become. She wasn't just changing things in her town. She was helping to change the mindset of people who were part of the larger system. Back home, Emily reflected on how much she had grown through the entire process. It hadn't been easy to share her experience, especially in such a public way, but in the end, it had been worth it. Her own sense of empowerment had grown alongside the changes that were taking place in the fire department and the community. Emily no longer felt like a victim of circumstance. She had become a force for change, a reminder to others that speaking up and standing firm in your beliefs could lead to something bigger than yourself. What started as a moment of personal mistreatment had turned into a movement toward respect, understanding, and change. And Emily knew that, although the journey was still ongoing, the difference she had made would be felt for years to come. The ripple effect of her actions had touched more lives than she could have ever imagined, and that thought alone gave her a sense of fulfillment she hadn't anticipated. Emily had learned that when you stand up for what's right, you not only change the situation at hand, but also inspire others to do the same. Her voice had become a beacon for those who felt unheard, a reminder that their stories mattered. In the end, that's all anyone could ask for, to be seen, to be heard, and to know that their voice had the power to make the world a better place. As weeks turned into months, Emily saw even more changes unfolding in her community. The fire department had truly started to shift. It wasn't just about training programs and policy changes anymore. The department was working hard to rebuild trust with the people they served. It became clear to Emily that change didn't always happen overnight. It took time, effort, and commitment. But it was happening, and that gave her hope. Emily continued to attend meetings with her husband, learning more about the bigger picture of public service and how it connected with the community. They met with other local leaders to discuss how respect could be woven into every aspect of the public services, not just the fire department. Emily often found herself speaking up, offering suggestions and ideas. At first, it felt strange to be part of these serious conversations, but over time, she became more confident. She wasn't just the governor's wife anymore. She was an advocate for positive change. Her husband was incredibly supportive, but Emily was beginning to realize that the change she was hoping for wasn't just about laws or policies. It was about shifting mindsets. It wasn't enough to fix things from the top down. People had to be willing to change the way they treated one another, too. The discussions they were having at the local meetings were about building empathy, understanding, and connection, not just enforcing rules. Emily's heart felt fuller as she realized how much of an impact these conversations could have in the long run. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and discussions, Emily sat down with her husband. She looked at him and asked, "Do you think things will really change for good?" Her husband took a moment, looking thoughtful. He had worked in politics for years, and he knew how difficult it could be to make lasting change. But he also believed deeply in the power of people coming together. "Change isn't easy," he said finally. "It's something that takes time, but it's possible. What we've done, is only the beginning. It's about planting seeds, and one day, those seeds will grow." Emily thought about his words. She knew they weren't going to see the full impact of their efforts right away, but she understood what he meant. Real change took time, and it often started with small actions. She had seen it firsthand. The way her speaking up had led to conversations that wouldn't have happened otherwise. She was learning that every step mattered. One day, Emily received a letter from someone she didn't know. It was from a woman who had been a victim of mistreatment by a different public service worker, and she wanted to thank Emily for standing up. She wrote about how Emily's actions had inspired her to speak out about her own experience. "Your story gave me the courage to finally tell someone what happened to me," the letter read. "Thank you for showing me that I don't have to stay quiet." Emily was deeply moved by the letter. It was proof that what she had done had a ripple effect. By simply sharing her story, she had helped someone else find their voice. The letter gave Emily a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that, even though her situation with the firefighters had been tough, it had led to something bigger. It wasn't just about holding people accountable. It was about creating an environment where people could speak up without fear of being dismissed or ignored. It was about making sure no one else had to experience the same kind of mistreatment she had. Emily didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer afraid to stand up for what was right. She had learned that the strength to make a difference often came from within. It was about being brave enough to challenge the status quo, even when it felt uncomfortable. And in doing so, she had inspired others to do the same. As the months passed, Emily continued to see more positive changes within the community. The fire department wasn't perfect, but it was better. And that was enough for her, for now. She knew that change was a journey, not a destination. But as long as people were willing to engage in difficult conversations and work together, she believed things could keep getting better. Emily smiled as she watched her town slowly transform. The lessons she had learned from this experience were ones she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Speaking out wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. As time went on, Emily began to realize that the work she had started wasn't over. Though she had helped bring about change in the fire department, she saw that the conversation around respect and accountability needed to continue. The fire department was only one piece of the puzzle, and there were other parts of public service that needed attention. Emily knew she couldn't stop now. There was still so much to be done. Her journey had opened her eyes to how easy it was for people in power to forget the human side of their work. It wasn't just about policies and procedures. It was about how they treated the people they were supposed to help. Emily had always believed that change started with individuals. She believed that if enough people began to demand better treatment, real transformation could happen. That idea became her mission. One afternoon, as Emily sat in her office, looking over notes from her latest community meeting, her phone rang. It was a local teacher who had heard about the changes in the fire department. The teacher, like many others in their town, had been inspired by Emily's courage to speak out. The teacher explained that in her own school, there were growing concerns about how some students were being treated unfairly by staff. It was an issue that many teachers and parents had noticed, but no one had ever spoken up. Emily listened closely as the teacher shared the details of what had been happening. Some students, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds, were being treated differently, not with the respect they deserved. The teacher wanted to know if Emily could help. Emily could hear the worry in the teacher's voice, but she also heard hope. The teacher believed that if they could raise awareness about this issue, things could change. It was a moment of clarity for Emily. She knew exactly what needed to be done. She couldn't ignore this situation, just like she hadn't ignored what happened with the fire department. This was another opportunity to help bring about change. Emily reached out to her husband, and together they began to talk about how they could address this issue in the school system. They knew it would take time and a lot of hard work, but they were ready. Emily couldn't bear the thought of other children being treated unfairly, just like she hadn't been able to ignore the firefighters' behavior. As Emily worked alongside the teacher and other community leaders to address the problem, she began to realize that the power of speaking out wasn't just about making noise. It was about building relationships. It was about sitting down with people, listening to their concerns, and finding common ground. It was about creating an environment where everyone felt safe enough to share their stories and be heard. Emily spent many hours working with local education officials, discussing how to improve the school's culture and create a system of support for all students. Together, they introduced new training programs for teachers, focusing on empathy, understanding, and treating every student with dignity. Emily also helped organize community meetings where parents and teachers could come together to talk openly about the challenges facing the school system. As the months passed, the school began to change. Teachers started to approach their students differently, taking the time to listen to them, especially those who had been struggling. It wasn't an instant transformation, but Emily could see the progress. Students who had once felt overlooked began to feel heard and valued. They started to open up, and their performance improved as a result. For Emily, this was proof that change was possible. It wasn't about pushing for perfection, but for progress. Each small step forward mattered. She knew that the road to real change was long, but she also knew that every conversation, every effort to improve the system, added to the bigger picture. Her work in the school system wasn't easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But Emily felt proud of the progress she had seen. The work wasn't finished, but it was moving in the right direction. She was once again reminded that even the smallest acts of speaking up, of standing firm, could make a world of difference. By the time Emily reflected on everything that had happened, she realized how much she had grown. What started as a personal experience of mistreatment had blossomed into something much bigger. She had learned that speaking out wasn't always easy or comfortable, but it was always necessary. As Emily looked back at how far she had come, she knew she was not just fighting for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt voiceless or unheard. She was helping to create a culture of kindness and respect, one step at a time. And in that, she found peace. As time passed, Emily continued to reflect on everything that had unfolded. What had started as a challenging and painful experience with the firefighters had become a journey of personal growth and community change. She had never expected such a small moment to lead to such a big impact. But here she was, having not only helped to transform the fire department, but also making waves in other areas of public service. Emily knew that real change was never quick or easy, but that didn't make it any less important. She had learned that even small steps forward could make a world of difference. Each story shared, each conversation held, had the power to change someone's life. She had seen it in the way people in her town had begun to treat one another more kindly and respectfully. She had felt it in her own heart, this deeper understanding of how people's actions could affect others. One day, while walking through the local park, Emily ran into a woman who had been part of the group she had worked with during the fire department's retraining process. The woman thanked Emily for the changes that had taken place in the department, saying it had made her feel safer in her own community. Emily smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. She had never set out to be a hero, but hearing those words made her realize how much her actions had touched others. The woman continued, "You helped us all see that we deserve respect, no matter who we are. It's been so empowering to know that someone listened, and that change could happen. Thank you for standing up." As Emily walked away from the park, she thought about what the woman had said. Sometimes, it was easy to forget how much a single voice could matter. In her case, it had been the simple act of sharing her story and standing up for herself. But that had led to something much bigger, a ripple effect that had influenced many others. Emily realized that the changes in her community were the result of countless people who had decided to speak out, just like she had. She wasn't alone in this fight for respect and fairness. Her work wasn't finished, of course. There would always be challenges ahead, but Emily felt more prepared now. She understood that change wasn't a destination. It was a continuous journey. There would be setbacks, and there would be progress, but the important thing was to never stop trying. Every day, she worked to make her community a better place, knowing that even small actions could have a lasting impact. Looking back at the beginning of her journey, Emily thought about how far she had come. The fear and uncertainty she had felt in the beginning now seemed distant. She had stepped into the unknown, unsure of what would happen, but she had found strength she didn't know she had. Emily now understood that finding her voice was not just about changing things for herself. It was about helping others find their voices too. Her experience with the fire department had opened her eyes to the deep-rooted problems in many of the systems around her. It wasn't just about holding individuals accountable. It was about creating lasting cultural shifts. She had helped to start that process, but Emily knew that the work had to keep going. Every person who spoke up, every person who demanded better, was part of something much larger. Together, they were creating a world where respect, understanding, and fairness were the foundation of public service. As Emily sat down one evening with her husband, reflecting on everything that had happened, she felt an overwhelming sense of pride. The work they had done was meaningful, and the change they had sparked was real. They had made a difference, not just for themselves, but for their entire community. She smiled softly, realizing that this was the power of standing up for what's right. It wasn't about expecting immediate results or gaining recognition. It was about knowing that your actions, no matter how small, could inspire others to do the same. And together, they could build something better, a future where respect and kindness were not just words, but actions that shaped the way people treated one another. Emily's journey had taught her many things, but perhaps the most important lesson of all was this: one voice, one person willing to stand up, could make a bigger difference than anyone ever imagined. And that gave her hope, not only for her own community, but for the world as a whole. It was proof that real change could start with just one person. And that's how movements begin. One step, one voice, at a time.